In the grand halls of the wealthy, where power was measured in gold and pride sat on every polished surface, no one ever looked twice at the maid's daughter. She was invisible, just another shadow trailing behind her mother's work. But one fateful evening, in front of the city's most powerful elite, that child was dragged into the spotlight for mockery. They thought it would be harmless entertainment, a cruel little joke. A servant's daughter seated before a piano she was never meant to touch. Guests leaned back with smirks, ready to laugh at her trembling hands, ready to confirm what they already believed, that brilliance belonged only to them. But then, she began to play. The laughter died, the whispers froze, and in that suffocating silence her music rose, raw, defiant, and unstoppable. Every note carried years of humiliation, every chord the strength of a spirit that refused to bow. What was meant to humiliate became a revelation, leaving even the proudest among them speechless. Yet brilliance comes at a price. For while the world saw a prodigy, one man saw only humiliation, her master, whose pride could not survive the light of her gift. What followed was not applause, but a battle, a war between prejudice and talent, cruelty and courage, silence and song. And at the center of it all stood a young girl who dared to turn pain into beauty, and a mother who risked everything to protect the flame that no lock, no order, and no hatred could extinguish. Because sometimes the smallest hands play the loudest truth. The mansion rose like a fortress of untouchable wealth, its marble steps gleaming in the sharp light of morning. Every detail carried the weight of generations who had hoarded fortunes, columns etched with care, statues carved by hands long dead, walls dressed in velvet and silk imported from corners of the world the staff would never see. To the city's elite, it was a symbol of legacy and dominion. To the ones who scrubbed its floors and polished its crystal chandeliers, it was nothing more than a gilded cage. Mariah had spent 15 years within its walls, her body bent by labor, her dignity pressed into silence. She rose before dawn, her fingers raw from endless scrubbing, her back aching from lifting and bending. She was known among the staff as dependable, steady, and compliant, though none saw the river of frustration flowing just beneath her calm exterior. Life had taught her to bow her head, to swallow words that could ignite punishment, and to preserve herself through silence. She endured for one reason only, her daughter. Althea had grown up in the shadow of this mansion. To her it was both playground and prison, a place of wonder she was never truly allowed to touch. At 6 years old she had trailed behind her mother, watching how she moved silently from room to room, folding sheets with precision, dusting without leaving a trace. She noticed how the guests never looked at her mother's face, how the other maids spoke in whispers when passing by. Even then, she understood something essential. To the world inside these walls, they were invisible. But invisibility was not enough to restrain Althea's restless spirit. She was drawn to details others ignored, the heavy rustle of silk gowns, as wealthy women descended the staircase, the echo of shoes clicking against marble floors, the hushed tones of businessmen exchanging secrets over cigars. Most of all, she was captivated by the piano that stood in the music room. It was an object of awe, its polished surface reflecting light like black glass, its keys ivory white against the dark mahogany. To guests, it was an ornament of culture, played only when a visiting musician was hired for a dinner party. To Althea, it was a mystery, a treasure chest that seemed to hold the world's secrets in its strings. Her fascination began quietly. Sometimes, while helping her mother polish the silver or dust the velvet chairs, she would pause at the threshold of the music room. She watched the piano from a distance, as though it were alive, as though it might speak if she dared to come closer. She had no teacher, No access to sheet music, not even permission to touch it, yet something about its presence stirred her deeply, like a whisper calling her name. By the time she was 9, curiosity overcame fear. Late one night, after the guests had retired and the halls were still, she crept into the music room barefoot. The chandelier above hung like a frozen waterfall, crystals catching the faint light of the moon. Her small hands hovered over the keys, trembling. She pressed one gently, and a single note rose into the silence. Pure, haunting, unlike anything she had ever heard. That single note became the beginning of her secret world. Whenever her mother worked late and the house slept, Althea stole into the room and experimented. She pressed keys at random at first, her ear guiding her as she sought patterns in the chaos. She discovered the way low notes rumbled like distant thunder, while high notes shimmered like fragile glass. She learned to weave them together, clumsy at first, but slowly shaping sounds that echoed her emotions. Music became her refuge, the place where she was no longer invisible. Every melody she stumbled upon carried pieces of her, the quiet longing she felt when she saw the wealthy children dressed in silk and lace, the sting of humiliation when she overheard whispers about her mother's skin, her place, her worth, the fire of defiance that smoldered within her despite the rules that tried to cage her. Mariah noticed her daughter's late-night absences, the way her eyes shone with secrets she did not share. At first she feared trouble, but one night, drawn by faint notes spilling into the corridor, she followed Althea into the music room. She stood in the doorway, watching her daughter's fingers stumble, pause, and begin again with stubborn persistence. The sight sent a tremor through her chest. Pride and fear tangled together. "Althea," she whispered, though the child did not hear. Mariah knew the risk. If the master of the house discovered what her daughter had been doing, there could be consequences, harsh ones. Yet she also understood the pull of that piano, how it gave her daughter a voice in a world determined to silence her. For the first time in years, Mariah allowed herself a fragile hope. Perhaps Althea's life could stretch beyond servitude, beyond the cage of invisibility that had trapped her own. But the world beyond the mansion walls was not gentle. When Althea accompanied her mother into town, the looks followed them. The stares lingered longer when the child's eyes lit up at the sight of books in shop windows, or when she paused near the local music store, pressing her face against the glass to glimpse the instruments inside. Whispers followed them. Words, not always audible but heavy enough to cut. Prejudice was not confined to the mansion. It draped itself across every corner of their lives. Still, Althea's hunger for music grew. By 12, she had memorized the feel of the piano keys under her fingers, the way certain combinations created harmony and others discord. She began to invent her own melodies, aching, triumphant, full of longing. Sometimes when her mother listened, tears welled in her eyes, though she tried to hide them. Mariah knew what her daughter could not yet grasp. The world was not ready to celebrate a black maid's daughter for genius. It was a world that mocked before it admired, that crushed brilliance beneath the weight of class and color. Yet, as she listened to the music filling that grand, empty room, she could not help but believe that one day someone would have to notice. And that day was drawing nearer than either of them realized. The days in the mansion fell into rhythm, each one echoing the last, as if time itself bowed before the unbroken traditions of wealth. The staff worked with mechanical precision, polishing, arranging, and anticipating every need of the master and his guests. Yet beneath the surface of order, tension brewed, the kind of tension that only those unseen could feel. Althea's life was measured in fragments, mornings spent trailing behind her mother, afternoons confined to quiet corners while guests strolled the halls, and nights where she carved out her secret rebellion at the piano. To her, Each stolen note was like breathing in freedom. But to the world around her, she remained a shadow, someone whose very existence was tolerated only so long as she remained silent. The mansion's owner, Mr. Whitmore, was a man of commanding presence. Tall, silver-haired, with eyes that flickered like cold steel, he carried himself with the authority of someone who believed the world owed him its attention. To him, the staff were background figures, like the furniture that kept his household functioning. He hardly noticed their names, much less their children. Yet his power loomed over them all, a reminder of their place. It was in this environment that Althea's hidden gift grew, unnoticed and unacknowledged, a flame flickering in the shadows. Still, destiny has a way of forcing brilliance into the light, and it would come in the form of a celebration unlike any she had yet witnessed. The announcement of Mr. Whitmore's grand gala spread quickly through the mansion. It was to be an evening of spectacle, where the most influential names in the city would gather beneath glittering chandeliers to toast their fortunes and flatter one another with words dripping in false sincerity. To the staff, it meant weeks of preparation, every surface scrubbed to perfection, every glass polished to a shine, every table draped in imported linen. To Althea, it meant one thing: opportunity. Though she was never invited, never even considered part of such affairs, she watched, she listened. When the musicians rehearsed, she lingered nearby, absorbing every sound. She noted the way their fingers moved, the way melodies connected like threads in an invisible tapestry. She had no lessons, no instruction, yet her ear was sharp, her instinct sharper still. As the gala drew nearer, the mansion buzzed with frantic energy. Mariah worked double her usual hours, her hands chapped from scrubbing, her back stiff from endless bending. She worried for her daughter, who seemed more restless with each passing day. Althea's eyes burned with anticipation, though she said nothing of her plans. She could feel the moment approaching, a moment when her voice, through music, might finally break free. On the morning of the gala, the mansion was transformed into a theater of excess. Florists delivered arrangements that spilled over with roses and lilies, their fragrance heavy in the air. Chefs orchestrated feasts in the kitchen, their clattering pots and sizzling pans echoing like percussion. Servants scurried, carrying trays, polishing banisters, ensuring no imperfection dared reveal itself to the guests who would soon arrive. Althea's mother warned her to stay out of sight that evening. "Keep to the servants' quarters," Mariah whispered, her voice urgent, almost pleading. She feared the arrogance of the wealthy, the cruelty that came when they felt their comfort disturbed. "Promise me you won't wander." Althea nodded, but her heart was not still. The pull of the music room, the lure of the piano, weighed on her more heavily than her mother's caution. She did not plan to interrupt, not openly, but she longed to hear, to feel, to absorb every note played by the hired musicians. Something deep within her whispered that tonight would be different. As the sun set, golden light spilling across the marble floors, carriages began to arrive. Guests stepped out dressed in silk gowns and tailored suits, jewels sparkling like constellations. Their laughter filled the entrance hall as servants bowed and directed them toward the grand ballroom. The mansion swelled with noise, with arrogance, with a kind of energy that made the air feel heavy. Althea remained in the shadows, her small figure blending into corners where no one cared to look. Her eyes darted, catching glimpses of the world she was never meant to belong to. The swirl of gowns, the glint of diamonds, the way guests lifted their noses as though the very air were beneath them. All of it pressed upon her, both fascinating and suffocating. In the center of it all stood the piano, polished to brilliance, waiting. It gleamed beneath the chandelier, a centerpiece of culture in a room designed to impress. Althea's pulse quickened every time her eyes found it. She knew she would never be allowed near it. Not tonight, not ever. Yet in her heart, she felt the keys calling. The musicians played as guests sipped champagne and exchanged false compliments. Their melodies danced in the air, light and effortless, crafted for the background. To most, it was simply sound to fill the silence between conversations. But to Althea, each note was a lesson. She studied their patterns, the rhythm, the way their hands moved with practiced grace. Every detail etched itself into her memory. As the evening unfolded, Mr. Whitmore made his rounds, greeting guests with rehearsed charm, boasting of his ventures, his investments, his power. To him, the gala was not about celebration, but demonstration, a chance to remind his peers of his dominance. And yet, fate had prepared a moment that would unravel his certainty in ways he could not imagine. For amid the glitter and arrogance, amid the endless laughter of the powerful, a girl from the shadows was waiting. A girl whose hands had never been taught, but whose heart knew music as if it were her native tongue. A girl destined to change everything with a single performance she had not yet planned, but which the night would demand of her. The hour grew late. The music softened, and the air grew heavy with wine and arrogance. And somewhere in the crowd, eyes began to notice her, the maid's daughter, too close to the music room, too curious for her own good. It was the beginning of the moment that would tear apart silence and replace it with something unforgettable. The gala swelled to its height, the ballroom vibrating with laughter, glasses clinking, and the smug murmur of conversations dripping with wealth and self-importance. The air grew heavy with perfume and the sweet scent of wine, a mixture so potent it almost masked the faint undertone of exhaustion carried by the servants who hurried between tables. Althea lingered in the shadows, where the chandeliers did not shine. She had promised her mother she would stay away, but her promise had shattered the moment she heard the piano sing. She stood close enough to see the gleam of the ivory keys, close enough to feel each note ripple through her chest like a second heartbeat. She was careful, cautious, but the pull was too strong. The guests, absorbed in their performance of elegance, barely noticed her at first. To them, she was no more than a shadow moving near the walls, just another child of a servant. But in places like this, shadows were not tolerated for long. Whispers began. A sharp glance from a jeweled woman, a hushed comment from a man with a silver pocket watch. Small ripples of disdain spreading outward, as though her very presence threatened the perfection of their evening. Maria saw it before her daughter did. From the far side of the room, as she balanced a tray of champagne flutes, her heart jolted. Fear surged through her veins. She willed Althea to retreat, to slip back into invisibility, but the girl's eyes were locked on the piano, and no force could pull her away now. It was Mr. Whitmore who noticed next. His gaze swept the room, scanning for imperfections, and settled on the girl standing too near the music room's threshold. He paused, lips curling into a faint smirk. To him, it was not a serious matter. A servant's daughter, out of place. That was hardly worth more than a passing amusement. But to the wealthy, amusement was often cruel. He raised his voice just enough for those nearby to hear. "What's this?" he said, his tone laced with mockery. The maid's little girl drawn to the piano. "Do you plan to entertain us, child?" Laughter rippled across the crowd, sharp and cold. Heads turned, eyes narrowing, mouths twisting into smiles that weren't smiles at all. Althea froze. The blood drained from her face, her body trembling beneath the weight of so many stares. She had wanted to listen, to learn, not to stand before them. Yet now, with a single careless remark, she had been thrust into their spotlight. Maria's tray, rattled as her hands shook. She wanted to step forward, to pull her daughter back into safety, but fear chained her in place. To defy the master, even in something so small, was unthinkable. One wrong move could cost her everything: her job, her shelter, the fragile life she had built. The guests' laughter grew, some clapping lightly, as though encouraging a spectacle. "Yes, let the girl play," one voice rang out, dripping with derision. "Surely she has been hiding a talent from us all." Another chuckled. "At least it will be entertaining. A little fun among friends." The words wrapped around Althea like a cage. Her throat tightened, her hands twitched at her sides. She had never performed for anyone but her mother. She had never played more than fragments of melodies she had pieced together in the quiet of empty rooms. To be forced into the center of their ridicule, it was unbearable. Yet something in her chest stirred, the same defiance that had carried her into the music room night after night. Mr. Whitmore leaned back, swirling the wine in his glass. His smirk widened. "Go on, then," he said, voice commanding yet careless, as though daring her to humiliate herself. "Play us something, for fun." The room erupted in applause, but it was not applause of encouragement. It was the applause of an audience eager to witness a fall. Althea's heart pounded, each beat louder than the last. She glanced toward her mother, whose eyes pleaded silently from across the room. Every instinct told her to run, to disappear back into the shadows where she belonged. Yet another voice within her whispered differently, a voice that had grown louder with every stolen note, every secret melody, a voice that said she was more than invisible. Her steps were slow, hesitant, as she moved toward the piano. The room hushed, laughter dimming into silence tinged with anticipation. Guests leaned forward in their chairs, curious, amused, expectant. They did not believe she could play. They wanted failure. They wanted proof that she was nothing more than the maid's daughter, incapable of matching their world of culture and refinement. She sat before the piano, the polished wood gleaming beneath her trembling hands. Her reflection stared back at her from the glossy surface, small, uncertain, yet filled with a fire she could not extinguish. She pressed her fingers to the keys, and the weight of the moment pressed back. Behind her, whispers hissed through the silence. "This should be good. She'll bang out nonsense. Poor thing doesn't even know where to begin." Her chest rose and fell. She closed her eyes, and in the darkness behind them, she remembered. She remembered the nights alone in the music room, when no one watched, when no one mocked. She remembered the melodies she had pieced together, the way her fingers had learned to speak when her voice could not. The silence stretched, taut as a string about to snap. Then, with trembling hands, she pressed a single key. A note rose into the air, pure, delicate, almost fragile. Another followed, then another, weaving together into a hesitant melody that slowly grew stronger. The laughter stilled, the whispers faded. Something had shifted, though she had only just begun. The first notes trembled like a fragile bird breaking free of its cage, fluttering uncertainly into the expectant silence. The guests leaned back, lips curled, waiting for the spectacle of failure. They expected noise, clumsy banging, proof that the maid's daughter was nothing but an intruder in their refined world. But the melody did not stumble. It grew. Her fingers, though small and trembling, found their way across the keys with instinct that no teacher had given her. Notes intertwined with one another, weaving into a song that was raw and unpolished, yet breathtakingly alive. It was not the practiced precision of the hired musicians, nor the predictable arrangements they had played earlier. It was something else entirely, something deeper. It carried sorrow and hope, longing and defiance, as though her entire existence had been poured into sound. The room shifted. Laughter stilled, replaced by an uneasy hush. Eyes widened, heads tilted. What they had dismissed as amusement was transforming into something they did not expect, something they could not ignore. Mariah's hands covered her mouth, her heart pounding as tears threatened to spill. She had heard her daughter play in secret, but never like this. Never with such urgency, such fire. In that moment, Althea was not the maid's daughter. She was a force, demanding to be seen. The chandelier above shimmered as though catching its own breath, casting fragments of light across the marble floor. The crowd, so accustomed to control, sat motionless. Their wine glasses, half raised, stilled in mid-air. The only movement in the room came from the girl at the piano, her small frame swaying with the rhythm, her eyes closed as she lost herself in the music. The melody rose higher, bolder, until it filled every corner of the room. It was imperfect, yes, but its imperfections gave it soul. It was not a performance to entertain, it was a declaration. Each note seemed to whisper, "I exist. I feel. I matter." Minutes passed, though to those listening it felt timeless. By the time she struck the final chord, her hands trembling above the keys, the silence that followed was deafening. No applause came at first. No one moved. They stared at her as though unsure of what had just unfolded, as though the rules of their world had been momentarily broken. The maid's daughter had not failed. She had triumphed, and that triumph unsettled them more than failure ever could. Finally, a single sound broke the stillness, a scoff. It came from the far side of the room, where a man with a crimson bow tie leaned back in his chair. "Amusing?" he said loudly, his voice cutting through the silence. "The child has a trick or two, but genius hardly." His words loosened the room. Murmurs spread, some nodding in agreement, others glancing uneasily at one another. To admit they had been moved by her was to admit that greatness could rise from places they deemed inferior, and that was something many of them were not prepared to do. Mr. Whitmore chuckled, swirling his wine. "Well," he said, his tone dripping with condescension, "perhaps the piano makes fools of us all. Who knew the maid's daughter had a tune in her?" His words were framed as amusement, but beneath them lay the unspoken message. Do not take this too seriously. The musicians who had stood to the side exchanged glances, glances that betrayed recognition of what they had just witnessed. For they, more than anyone, knew talent when it revealed itself. Yet they, too, remained silent. To speak openly in her favor would be to challenge the very hierarchy that paid them. Althea sat frozen on the bench, her chest heaving, her fingers still hovering above the keys. She felt both powerful and vulnerable, as though she had revealed a piece of her soul that could not be taken back. She wanted to look at her mother, to draw strength from her presence, but fear held her eyes downward. Mariah's tears slipped free at last, though she quickly turned her face so no one would see. Pride warred with terror inside her, pride in her daughter's brilliance, terror of the price they might pay for daring to shine in a room that demanded their silence. The moment fractured further as laughter trickled back into the air, not the joyous laughter of before, but nervous, uneasy, edged with cruelty. Guests shook their heads, dismissing what they had just heard as little more than a novelty. "A party trick," one woman whispered. She probably memorized a piece she overheard, but beneath the surface, not everyone was dismissive. A few lingered in their silence, eyes fixed on the girl at the piano, troubled by what they had witnessed. They could not bring themselves to admit it aloud, but deep down they knew. They had been moved. Mr. Whitmore clapped his hands lightly, as though concluding a show. "Well done, child," he said with mock cheer. "You've given us all a bit of fun." His eyes, cold and sharp, met hers for a brief moment. In that gaze was both warning and dismissal. "Remember your place." The guests applauded then, but it was shallow, perfunctory, a way to close the uncomfortable gap the music had left. The sound rang hollow against the marble walls. Althea rose from the bench, her legs trembling, her chest tight. She wanted to run, to vanish back into the shadows, where she belonged, but something inside her refused. Though they laughed, though they mocked, she had felt the silence before the scoff, the silence when they had been listening. She had felt the power of her music filling their lungs, pressing against their hearts. That moment was hers, and no dismissal could erase it. She returned to her mother's side, head bowed but spirit alight. Maria pressed her hand against her daughter's back, whispering nothing but holding everything in her touch. Love, fear, pride, sorrow. The party resumed its rhythm, guests eager to drown the disturbance in more laughter, more wine, more empty conversation. Yet beneath the surface a crack had formed. For once seen, brilliance cannot be unseen. And though they tried to bury it beneath condescension, the memory of those notes lingered in the corners of their minds. Althea had not just played the piano, she had challenged their world, and the consequences of that challenge were only beginning. Theseus, morning after the gala dawned cold and gray, as though the sky itself carried the residue of the night before. The mansion, usually hushed after an evening of excess, buzzed with fragments of conversation. Servants shuffled about their duties, but their eyes lingered on one another, their whispers weaving through the corridors like smoke. The subject of those whispers was not the extravagant feast, nor the jewels that had glittered beneath the chandeliers, nor even the drunken boastings of the city's most powerful men. It was the girl, the maid's daughter, the child who had touched the piano. Some spoke with awe, lowering their voices as if reverence might soften the weight of their words. "Did you hear? She played as though she had been born to it. I never thought—" Others shook their heads, their tones sharp with caution. "Careful, it's dangerous for her. The master won't like being made a fool in his own house." Maria heard every whisper, though none were addressed to her. She kept her eyes down as she worked, polishing silver until her reflection blurred in the shining surface. Each murmur scraped against her heart, praise mixed with foreboding. She had always known her daughter carried something extraordinary, but last night had forced it into the open. And in this house, in this world, being extraordinary was not always a gift. Althea felt the weight of the morning too, though differently. She woke in the cramped servants' quarters with the memory of the piano still burning in her fingertips, the silence that had fallen before the scoff, the way the air had shifted when her music filled the hall. It lived inside her like a flame. She replayed it again and again, that moment when her invisibility shattered, when every eye had been forced to see her. For the first time she felt the possibility of something larger than herself. The piano was no longer just a secret companion. It was a voice, one that could not be silenced by laughter or dismissal. Yet with that realization came unease. She had seen the way they looked at her afterward, the narrowed eyes, the stiffened smiles, the mutters dripping with scorn. Her gift had unsettled them, and unsettled people often struck back. By midday, the whispers had drifted beyond the servants' quarters. In the city's drawing rooms and parlors, where ladies in silk gowns traded gossip over tea, the tale spread like fire. "Imagine, the maid's daughter seated at the piano as though she were one of us," one woman exclaimed, her tone a mixture of shock and amusement. It was outrageous. Another laughed lightly, fanning herself. "I heard she played something remarkable, though surely it was just luck." A few memorized notes, nothing more. The story reached men as well, in smoking rooms clouded with cigar haze. Whitmore must be losing his grip, one said with a smirk, allowing his servant's child to parade before his guests. What next? Shall she take up residence at his table? Laughter roared in reply. The incident became a joke, a tale, to repeat with exaggerated flourishes, always ending in laughter at the absurdity of it all. But not all dismissed her. A few voices, quieter, wondered aloud if perhaps the girl did possess talent. A merchant's wife who had studied piano in her youth confessed to a friend, "There was something in the music, something I cannot explain. It was not polished, but it was alive." Yet even she ended her remark with a sigh. Of course it cannot matter. She is who she is. Maria felt the shift most acutely when she was summoned to Mr. Whitmore's study. The summons itself filled her with dread, her hands trembling as she approached the carved oak doors. Inside, he sat behind a desk heavy with papers, his gaze sharp as a blade. "Your daughter," he said without preamble, "has a taste for spectacle." Maria bowed her head, words caught in her throat. "She embarrassed this household," he continued, his voice cold, measured. "Do you understand? Guests came for refinement, for culture, not to be subjected to a servant's child pretending at talent. She wanted to speak, to defend Althea, to say that it had not been pretense but something real, something undeniable. But the words withered before they reached her lips. To speak them would be to challenge him, and challenge carried consequences she could not bear. "Yes, sir," she whispered instead, her voice barely audible. Whitmore leaned back, steepling his fingers. "See to it that it does not happen again. Keep her in her place, or you may find yourselves without one." The dismissal was final. Maria left with her head bowed, her body trembling, her spirit caught between rage and despair. She longed to shield her daughter, to hide her brilliance, away where it could not be mocked or crushed. But she also knew that brilliance could not be contained forever. That evening, as they sat together in the quiet of their quarters, Althea sensed her mother's heaviness. She pressed her small hand against Maria's, her voice soft but steady. They laughed, she whispered, but for a moment they listened. Maria's heart broke at the innocence in her daughter's words. Yes, they had listened, and yes, that was dangerous. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the mansion grew tense. Some servants avoided Althea altogether, fearing that even association might draw Whitmore's wrath. Others regarded her with a strange mix of admiration and pity. The musicians who had played that night offered no words, but their eyes, when they passed her in the hall, betrayed a silent acknowledgment. For Althea, life continued in shadows, but the shadows felt different now. The piano called to her with greater urgency, its keys whispering promises of a future she could barely imagine. Each night she returned to it, her fingers tracing melodies more confident, more daring. Her gift was growing, even as the world tried to deny it. Yet beyond the mansion walls, the gossip had taken root. The story of the maid's daughter at the piano became a parlor tale, retold with sneers and laughter. The city's elite wore it as proof of their superiority. How amusing, how absurd, that someone from so low could believe she belonged among them. Althea did not hear their words directly, but she felt their weight. In the way some guests glanced at her when they visited again. In the way laughter sometimes erupted as she passed. In the way her mother's hand tightened protectively around hers, as though shielding her from an invisible storm. The storm was coming, and though neither of them could yet see its full fury, the first winds had already begun to howl. The days after Whitmore's warning passed like a tightening noose. Maria walked through the mansion with her head bowed lower than before, her every step haunted by the possibility of dismissal. Losing this job meant more than losing wages. It meant losing the fragile roof that sheltered her and Althea. It meant hunger, cold, uncertainty. And so she silenced her voice, swallowed her pride, and prayed her daughter would not ignite more anger. But Althea was no longer the same girl. Something had awakened in her that night at the gala. She had felt power in the music, a power that defied silence. Even when she tried to hide, even when she tried to obey her mother's pleas, her fingers itched for the piano keys. It was no longer a secret game. It was a calling. In the grand salons of the city, the story of the maid's daughter who fancied herself a pianist hardened into something crueler. What had once been whispered with laughter was now repeated with sneers. Children of wealthy families imitated her behind closed doors, mocking her posture, mimicking her earnest expression at the keys. Adults chuckled at the joke, reinforcing it, turning her moment of courage into a caricature. When the Whitmores hosted guests again, the cruelty reached her ears directly. Althea carried a tray into the parlor, her small hands steady, her steps careful. She had learned to blend into the background, to be invisible. Yet as she passed a group of finely dressed women, she heard the words like knives. "There she is," one whispered loudly enough to be heard. "The little prodigy." Ripple of laughter followed. Another added, "Perhaps she'll entertain us again." "A servant's recital, how charming." The words burned. Althea kept her eyes forward, her lips pressed tight, but inside her chest a storm raged. She wanted to shout that she was not their entertainment, not their jest, but silence was all she had been taught, and so silence became her shield. That evening, Maria found her daughter sitting alone in the servants' quarters, her back straight, her eyes hard with unshed tears. "Mama," Althea whispered, "why do they hate me for playing? Didn't they hear it? Didn't they feel it?" Maria's heart ached at the question. She stroked her daughter's hair and held her close. "They are blind, child. Blind to anything that does not come from their own kind. It is not your fault. It is their cruelty." But even as she spoke, she feared the truth, that the world was not only cruel, but powerful enough to crush whatever spark her daughter carried. Mr. Whitmore's second warning came swiftly. Summoning Maria once again to his study, he was sharper. This time, his voice carrying the cold bite of finality. "I will not have my household turned into a spectacle," he said, his gaze like ice. "Already people laugh. Already my name is dragged into their little amusements. If your daughter so much as touches that piano again, you will both be gone. Do you understand?" Maria nodded, her silence heavy with despair. She left the room, with her knees weak, her resolve cracking. She wanted to obey, to keep her daughter safe, but she knew Althea's spirit. The music was not a habit to be broken. It was life itself. And so, the inevitable came. At another gathering, weeks later, the tension snapped. The ballroom was filled once more with glittering gowns and polished shoes, with laughter that echoed off marble walls. Althea moved quietly among them, carrying her mother's tray, her eyes lowered. She thought perhaps she could endure that. If she remained invisible, the evening might pass without cruelty. But the wealthy children, emboldened by their parents' mockery, sought her out. A boy no older than 14 smirked as she passed. "Play us a song," he sneered. "The maid's daughter is a prodigy, isn't she?" Laughter erupted. Another chimed in. "Yes, give us a performance. Entertain us, little servant." The adults looked on with amused smiles, their indifference a permission for the cruelty to grow. Althea froze, the tray trembling in her hands. Heat surged through her face, shame burning hotter than fire. She wanted to run, to hide, but the circle, of laughter had already closed around her. She stood trapped, humiliated, their jeers pressing down on her like weights. Mariah, seeing from across the room, rushed to her daughter's side. She took the tray from her trembling hands and guided her away, her voice steady though her heart quaked. "Enough," she said firmly to the children, but they only laughed harder. To them, her dignity meant nothing. In the quiet of the kitchen, away from the echo of their laughter, Althea wept. Her sobs were not only of shame but of rage. Rage at being reduced to a joke, at having her gift twisted into mockery. Between tears, she choked out the words, "I will never stop playing, never, not even if they laugh until the end of time." Mariah held her daughter tightly, torn between fear and pride. She wanted to protect her, to silence her defiance for the sake of safety. Yet in her daughter's vow, she heard the echo of something greater than both of them, a refusal to let hate define her. The night ended, but the humiliation did not fade. Althea carried it like a scar, etched deeper with every whisper, every sneer. Yet beneath the wound, her resolve grew harder, sharper. She would not let them decide who she was. The rising tide of cruelty had reached its peak. The stage was set. The world had made its judgment, mocking and dismissing her. But in the silence after the storm of laughter, a new fire burned within. Her Althea was no longer just a girl sneaking to the piano in secret. She was a voice waiting to erupt, a storm gathering strength, and the next time they forced her into the light, she would not retreat. Winter had settled heavily over the city, draping the streets in frost and blanketing the rooftops in snow that glittered beneath the pale moonlight. For the Whitmore mansion, winter meant more than chill air and shorter days. It meant the arrival of the annual banquet, the most extravagant gathering of the season. Politicians, businessmen, socialites, and their families would converge on the house, their presence a declaration of status. Inside the mansion, preparations began weeks in advance. Servants polished every surface until it gleamed, laid out velvet, runners on staircases, and pressed table linens until a single wrinkle would have been scandalous. Crates of wine and delicacies arrived daily, their contents more costly than a year of wages. Mariah worked tirelessly, her body moving with practiced efficiency, but her mind churned with dread. She remembered Whitmore's warning like a curse, etched into her bones. "If your daughter so much as touches that piano again, you will both be gone." The memory of Althea's public humiliation still ached like a fresh wound. Mariah resolved that this night, above all others, Althea would remain invisible. Yet Althea herself was restless. She had grown quieter since the jeers at the last party, but beneath her silence lived a fire that Mariah could not extinguish. The piano called to her in dreams, in idle moments, in the very rhythm of her heartbeat. Though fear shadowed her, something deeper urged her forward. Defiance, hope, destiny. The night of the banquet arrived with a flurry of horse-drawn carriages at the gate and diamonds glistening in the candlelight. The mansion transformed into a palace of spectacle. Musicians played string quartets in the foyer, waiters glided with silver trays, and laughter filled the cavernous halls. Althea moved among the servants, her eyes lowered, her tray steady in her small hands. She reminded herself of her mother's plea. Stay silent, stay unseen. But unseen was impossible. Whispers already followed her, even before the cruelest blow would fall. A woman in an emerald gown leaned toward her companion as Althea passed. "There she is, the little pianist," she said with mocking sweetness. Her companion chuckled. "Yes, I was hoping we might get a repeat performance. Such entertainment is rare." The words clung to Althea's skin like ice. She kept her gaze down, but her heart pounded. Hours passed, the banquet swelling with indulgence. At the peak of the evening, when glasses clinked and laughter rose like thunder, the cruelty surfaced in full. It began innocently, or so it seemed. A guest, flushed with drink and arrogance, stood near the piano in the corner of the great hall. With a smirk, he tapped his glass with a spoon, drawing attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he declared, his voice loud enough to cut through the music and chatter, "I've heard a tale most amusing. They say within this household dwells a prodigy, though not of noble blood, not of wealthy training, but of rather humble origins." Laughter rippled through the crowd, eager for spectacle. The man gestured broadly toward Althea, who froze where she stood, tray trembling in her hands. "There she is," he crowed. "The maid's daughter. Shall we not have her play for us?" Again, a little diversion, for fun. The words fell heavy, their cruelty masked as charm. A chorus of agreement followed. Some clapped their hands, others jeered playfully, their amusement at her expense swelling like a tide. "Yes! Yes! Let the girl play!" voices cried. "Give us a performance!" Maria, standing nearby, felt the blood drain from her face. She moved quickly, placing herself between her daughter and the crowd's eyes. Her voice, trembling but firm, rose above the din. "Please, sirs, ladies, she is only a child. She was foolish once, but it will not happen again." But her protest was met with dismissive laughter. "Oh, come now," someone sneered. "It will be charming. A parlor trick to amuse the evening." Whitmore himself, standing at the edge of the gathering, watched with narrowed eyes. He said nothing at first, his silence a dangerous weight. When Maria turned to him, desperation in her gaze, his lips curled into a thin, cold smile. "Let them have their entertainment," he said softly, though the softness carried venom. "Do not deny the guests their amusement." Maria's heart clenched. She looked to her daughter, who stood pale and trembling, her wide eyes darting between the piano and the crowd. The guests pressed closer, their laughter filling the room. "Play, girl," someone shouted. "Let us see the prodigy." Maria wanted to drag her daughter away, to hide her, to shield her from the cruelty that had turned her into a spectacle. But she felt Whitmore's gaze burning into her, a silent command that held her trapped. Althea stood rooted, the noise of the crowd crashing over her like waves. Her breath came fast, her chest tight. She wanted to vanish, to melt into the marble floor, but the laughter only grew louder. Every second she hesitated fed their amusement. Then, slowly, as though pulled by invisible strings, she set down the tray. The crowd quieted slightly, expectant now, eager to watch the comedy of a servant's child fumbling at the keys. She walked toward the piano, her small steps echoing in the cavernous hall. The instrument loomed before her, polished and gleaming beneath the chandelier's glow. She had touched it in secret, in shadows, but now every eye in the room pinned her to its bench. The jeers rose again as she sat. "Careful, girl, don't break it," one man shouted, sending a wave of laughter through the hall. Althea placed her hands in her lap, trembling. Her throat ached with unshed tears, her ears burned with shame. Yet beneath the storm of humiliation, the flame inside her still flickered. She remembered her vow, whispered through tears weeks before. "I will never stop playing. Never." She drew in a deep breath and lifted her hands. The room leaned forward, expecting failure, ready to laugh, and then her fingers touched the keys. The first notes trembled as they slipped from the piano, fragile as a bird's wings caught in wind. The crowd chuckled, some whispering snide remarks, certain that the maid's daughter would deliver only awkward noise. Yet Althea's hands, though shaking, found their place. Slowly the melody began to weave itself together. At first the guests exchanged smirks, waiting for the comedy to unravel. But the comedy never came. Althea's fingers grew steadier, her movements more assured. What began as fragile notes swelled into something deeper, richer. The sound filled the great hall, climbing, the chandeliers lingering against the polished walls. The laughter faltered, hesitation creeping into the faces that moments earlier had mocked her. She closed her eyes, shutting out their stares, their sneers, their world. The music carried her somewhere else, back to the nights in the darkened salon when she had played in secret for no one but herself. Each note was a memory, a piece of her soul laid bare, her mother's sacrifice, her own loneliness, the sting of humiliation, the fragile hope that refused to die. The melody surged, no longer timid but commanding. It spoke of pain and resilience, of sorrow transmuted into beauty. Those who listened found themselves disarmed. Some shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet each other's eyes. Others sat frozen, their breaths shallow, their hearts caught in the invisible grip of her music. An elderly woman near the front dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief, though she could not have explained why. A young man who had been smirking now leaned forward, transfixed. Even the servants in the shadows paused, in their work, drawn by the unexpected power spilling from the keys. The hall, once filled with laughter and chatter, had fallen utterly silent. Only the piano spoke now, carrying every emotion Althea had buried in her chest. Whitmore himself stood rigid, his jaw tight, his knuckles white as he gripped his glass. This was no spectacle, no parlor trick. It was brilliance, undeniable. Brilliance that threatened to mock not Althea but him, the master who had dismissed her, the man who claimed control over everything within his house. Still, Althea played. She played until her fear dissolved into fire, until every jeer became fuel, until she no longer felt the weight of their judgment. For those minutes, she was not the maid's daughter. She was not invisible. She was music itself. When the final note lingered in the air, the silence that followed was heavier than any sound. The crowd sat motionless, caught between prejudice and awe, between habit and truth. Then, somewhere near the back, a single pair of hands began to clap. The sound cracked through the silence like a spark. Slowly, uncertainly, others joined. Applause spread, awkward at first, then swelling as more and more were unable to deny what they had witnessed. Yet the applause carried unease. It was reluctant, fractured, tinged with disbelief that such power could come from a child they had mocked. Maria stood at the edge of the room, tears streaming down her face. Her daughter had done it. She had taken their cruelty and answered, with beauty so undeniable it silenced them. Pride swelled in her chest, but fear lingered still, for she knew Whitmore's pride had been pierced, and that wound would not heal quietly. Althea opened her eyes, her small hands still resting on the keys. She saw the crowd differently now. Their faces no longer loomed as threats but shrank before her gaze. She had spoken a language they could not control, and for once they had listened. But beneath the applause, beneath the forced smiles, Whitmore's fury simmered. His mind raced as he imagined the gossip that would ripple through the city, not of his wealth, not of his power, but of a servant's child who had stolen the evening. To him it was not Althea's triumph, but his humiliation. He forced a thin smile as guests turned to him, murmuring words of praise laced with surprise. Remarkable, some said. Unexpected. Others laughed nervously, unsure whether to celebrate or dismiss what they had seen. Whitmore inclined, his head offering polite replies, but his jaw remained clenched. Inside, his anger roared. Maria guided her daughter gently from the bench, her hand trembling as it clutched Althea's. She whispered softly, "You were magnificent." Althea looked up, her eyes shining, not with arrogance, but with a quiet certainty. They listened, she said simply. Yes, they had, and nothing in the world could erase that. But as the applause faded and conversation resumed, the air in the hall shifted once more. Prejudice reasserted itself, trying desperately to cover the crack Althea's music had made. Some guests dismissed her performance as a novelty, a curiosity. Raw talent, perhaps, one man said with a shrug, but untamed. She will never be truly refined. Another added, quite bold of Whitmore to let her play, risky even. Their laughter returned, softer now, but present. Still, beneath their words, something had changed. The image of Althea at the piano lingered in their minds, unsettling, undeniable. Whitmore excused himself early, retreating to his study under the pretense of business. There alone he poured himself a drink with shaking hands. The echo of her music haunted him, not as beauty, but as defiance. He had spent his life ensuring order, maintaining control, and yet in his own hall, before his own guests, a child had undone it all. His fury was not only at her, but at himself, for allowing it, for underestimating her, for knowing that the story of this night would spread far beyond these walls. Althea had triumphed, but the cost was yet to come. The climax had torn the veil, exposing both her brilliance and Whitmore's vulnerability. The world would not be the same after this night, for Maria, for Althea, or for the man whose pride had been broken by the music of a servant's child. The storm had broken, but its thunder still echoed, and in its wake a reckoning approached. The morning after the banquet dawned with a strange stillness. The great house seemed to hold its breath, as if even its walls were uncertain of what had unfolded the night before. For years its halls had been a theater of wealth and superiority, where nothing occurred without Whitmore's consent. But now, for the first time, something beyond his control lingered in the air. Althea's music still echoed like a ghost he could not exorcise. Maria woke early, long before the other servants stirred. Sleep had evaded her. She had lain awake replaying the night again and again. She had watched her daughter silence a room filled with men and women who considered themselves untouchable arbiters of refinement. She had seen their sneers melt into awe, their arrogance falter before the undeniable. And yet, her pride was laced with fear. She knew how men like Whitmore responded when their authority was shaken. He had smiled at his guests, feigning civility, but Maria had known that smile for years. It was a mask stretched thin over a storm. She found Althea curled on her narrow bed, her small hands resting loosely as though they still carried the echo of the piano's keys. Her face in sleep was peaceful, but Maria knew that peace would not last. The world had noticed her now, and the world, as cruel as it was curious, did not forgive easily. Downstairs the house buzzed with hushed talk among the staff. Word of the performance had already taken root. The butler whispered that several guests had departed, speaking only of the girl. The cook recounted overhearing a lady's carriage driver marveling at the way the entire room had frozen. Even the scullery maids, who seldom paid attention to the world beyond their chores, repeated the tale as though it were legend. But above all, there was speculation. What would Mr. Whitmore do? The answer revealed itself soon enough. In his study, Whitmore sat rigid in a high-backed chair, his untouched breakfast cooling on the tray beside him. The fire had burned low, yet sweat beaded at his brow. He had scarcely slept, haunted by the melody that had filled his hall. He told himself it was nothing but sound, yet it returned again and again, unwelcome and unyielding. The night should have cemented his power, not undermined it. The banquet had been intended to showcase his wealth, his influence. Instead, all anyone spoke of was the performance of a servant's child. His name had been overshadowed in his own house. To him it was humiliation. He imagined the conversations already spreading through the city, the ridicule, the sly remarks from rivals. Ah yes, Whitmore's grand soiree, the one where the maid's daughter outshone him. Each imagined. Whisper fanned his fury. When Mariah entered to tidy the room, she could feel his anger like heat radiating from the walls. He did not look at her as she moved quietly, but his silence was heavier than words. At last he spoke, his voice cold, measured. Your daughter made quite a spectacle last night. Mariah froze, her back still turned as she adjusted the curtains. She wanted to answer with pride, to say yes. She had been magnificent. But she knew the danger of such defiance. Instead, she murmured, "She only did what was asked of her." Asked? He repeated sharply, his chair scraping as he stood. He moved across the room until his shadow loomed over her. "No one commands in this house but me. Do you understand that?" Mariah lowered her eyes, her heart thudding. "Yes, sir." Whitmore studied her, searching for submission in her face. But beneath her lowered gaze, something had changed. He saw it, though he could not name it. The same shift he had glimpsed, in the girl as she played, that quiet certainty, that unyielding spark, he now saw mirrored in the mother. And it unsettled him. He dismissed her with a flick of his hand, yet the encounter gnawed at him long after she was gone. For the first time in years, he felt the fragile edges of control slipping. Meanwhile, in the servants' quarters, Althea sat by the small window, staring out at the frosted garden. She had never seen the world as wide as she did now. Her music, once a secret between her and the silence, had been heard, truly heard. The memory of the faces in the crowd returned to her, not the laughter at the start, but the silence that had followed, the tears, the awe. For the first time she understood that her gift was more than a pastime. It was power. Yet with that realization came fear. She had felt Whitmore's eyes on her even as she played, cold and sharp like a blade. She knew he had not been moved as the others had. Where they had seen beauty, he had seen defiance. Mariah joined her daughter at the window, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You must be careful," she whispered. "Last night was something no one can forget. But it is also something some will wish to bury." Althea looked up at her mother, confusion flickering in her young eyes. "But they listened. They heard me." "Yes," Mariah said softly, her throat tightening. "And that is why they will fear you." Outside the city stirred, unaware that within the walls of Whitmore's estate, a battle of wills was beginning. A battle between the pride of a master desperate to maintain control and the rising flame of a child whose music had already begun to crack the foundation of his power. The night of the banquet had not ended with Althea's final note. It had only begun. By midday, the weight of whispers pressed heavily on Whitmore's house. Letters arrived in a steady stream, hand-delivered by messengers dressed in their master's livery. Each bore the same underlying curiosity. Is it true? Did the maid's daughter really play? Some requests were veiled in politeness, an invitation for a demonstration, phrased as though they wished only to indulge a parlor amusement. Others were more direct, demanding confirmation of what society already buzzed about. Whitmore did not answer any of them. He tore several letters in half before the ink had dried from his first reading. The very idea that his home, his authority, could be overshadowed by a child he considered beneath notice was intolerable. Worse still, the requests did not treat him as the subject of intrigue. They treated him as a mere bystander to his own event. By evening, he resolved to crush the matter before it grew further. He summoned Mariah to his study. She entered with her usual composure, her hands folded neatly in front of her. But inside she braced herself, sensing what was to come. Whitmore did not bother with preamble. "Your daughter will not touch that piano again," he declared, his voice sharp enough to slice the air. "Not here, not anywhere. She embarrassed me once. I will not allow it to happen again." Mariah's breath caught, but she kept her eyes steady. "She did not embarrass you, sir. She—" "Do not contradict me." He slammed his hand on the desk, making the ink bottle rattle. "She made a mockery of my house, turning it into a circus. My guests came to honor me, and instead they left speaking of her. Do you understand what that does to a man in my position?" Mariah wanted to answer that no music could wound a man unless his pride was already brittle. But she bit the words back, knowing such boldness could cost her more than she could pay. Whitmore leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. "I will not tolerate insubordination in my household, not from her, not from you. The piano is closed to her. If I hear even a whisper that she has played again, you will both be turned out onto the street. Do you understand me?" Mariah bowed her head. "Yes, sir," but deep within, something stirred. Fear, yes, but also resolve. She had watched her daughter's brilliance spill out into that hall like light breaking through stone. To smother it now would be to betray everything she had endured to protect her child. For the first time, Mariah felt the dangerous weight of choice pressing against her chest. Meanwhile, outside the manor, the story of the girl spread further. At markets and in salons, people argued over it as though they had all been there. Some dismissed it as exaggeration. A maid's daughter? Impossible. Others whispered of miracles, insisting that even the most skeptical guests had been silenced. The tale grew with each telling, turning Althea into a figure of rumor, if not, yet of recognition. Among the servants, the legend grew faster still. The stable boys repeated it to the maids, who told it to the cooks, who passed it to the errand boys. They recounted every detail, from the mocking laughter at the beginning to the stunned silence at the end. For them, it was more than entertainment. It was proof that one of their own could rise, even for a moment, above those who held them down. Althea, however, was shielded from much of this by Mariah. The child sensed the change, the glances cast her way by the other servants, the quiet reverence when she passed. But her mother's firm hand guided her away from gossip and into silence. "Do not let their voices make your head too heavy," Mariah warned. "What you have is precious, but it is also dangerous." Still, Althea could not help but dream. In the quiet hours, she replayed the memory of the hall, the way her music had commanded their attention. She imagined playing not just for those who mocked her, but for those who would listen, truly listen. The dream tugged at her, even as her mother's caution urged restraint. Whitmore, however, was not content with warnings. Days after the banquet, he ordered the piano in the grand hall locked. He instructed the butler to ensure no key was left within reach. The servants were warned under threat of dismissal. If the girl so much as touched the instrument again, they would all suffer. It was an act of desperation disguised as authority. The locked piano stood as a symbol of his fear, as though a child's music could topple his entire empire. Mariah saw it for what it was. She said nothing, but each time she passed the piano, her resolve deepened. It was not the girl's gift that shamed Whitmore. It was his inability to silence it. One evening, after Althea had gone to bed, Mariah sat alone in the quiet kitchen. Her hands folded in her lap, she thought of the choices before her. She could obey, smother her daughter's gift, and ensure their safety within these walls. Or she could defy him, risking everything, but preserving the flame that had already begun to burn too brightly to be extinguished. Her heart ached with the weight of it. She had always been cautious, always bent beneath the rules of survival. But now she wondered if survival alone was enough. For the first time, Maria allowed herself to imagine a future beyond Whitmore's house. A future where Althea's music was not a secret to be hidden, but a light to be seen. The thought frightened her, but it also gave her strength. The banquet had changed many things, but most of all, it had changed her. Winter deepened, but within the Whitmore estate the air was colder than the frost outside. The locked piano sat like a coffin in the grand hall, its polished wood gleaming, its silence louder than any music. Servants passed it with lowered eyes, as if even glancing at it might summon punishment. But Althea could not stop hearing its voice. At night, when the house was quiet, she would press her ear to its lid, listening for echoes that did not exist. It was as if the piano mourned alongside her, trapped, its strings yearning to be touched. Whitmore, satisfied that he had reasserted control, carried himself with renewed arrogance. He entertained fewer guests now, wary of further gossip, but in private he convinced himself the scandal would fade. Time had always been his ally. Society's attention was fickle, and soon they would move on to some new spectacle. Yet in truth, the whispers had not died. They had simply gone underground, traded in hushed tones. Althea's name slipped into drawing rooms and marketplaces alike, carried by curiosity and wonder. A story denied became a story more sought after. Maria felt this shift keenly. Each day she watched her daughter grow restless, her fingers tapping invisible keys on tables, windowsills, her own arms. Music poured out of the girl even without an instrument, and Maria knew it could not be contained. To silence it was to silence her very being. One evening, after Althea had been sent to bed, Whitmore cornered Maria in the hallway. His tone was deceptively calm. "I hear some of the staff still speak of that night," he said. "See to it that they stop. You are responsible for keeping order among them." Maria bowed her head, but she did not answer immediately. Her silence stretched until it became its own kind of defiance. When she finally spoke, her voice was low but steady. "Order, sir, cannot erase what was heard." His eyes narrowed, catching the edge in her tone. "Careful," he warned. But Maria no longer trembled as she once did. That night, she sat by the dying fire and made a decision that would alter the course of both their lives. Althea's gift was not a burden to be hidden. It was a light to be guarded, nurtured, and when the time came, released into the world beyond these walls.